We begin my top 36 remaining wide receiver rankings. Remember that these rankings do not include players from Thursday or Friday's games as they've already played. With wide receivers that I think are in that mid to low end wide receiver 3 range, we have Nick Westbrook-Akine, Adonai Mitchell, Vele, Douglas, Addison, and Deebo Samuel. Nick Westbrook-Akine has scored 6 touchdowns in the past 7 games and had at least 5 targets in 3 of the past 4. I think that continues here against Washington. I'm projecting another touchdown for him, and I think he's a fine flex play or low-end wide receiver 3. Adonai Mitchell hasn't really been able to get much going this season, but with Josh Downs out, he should see some extended work. I do think he scores a touchdown, giving us a fine flex play low-end wide receiver 3 finish. Devon Vele has scored at least 10 fantasy points in 3 straight weeks. I think here against Cleveland that's going to continue, and I think he's a fine mid to low-end wide receiver 3. Demario Douglas has had at least 9 fantasy points in each of the past 4 weeks. I think that continues here against Indianapolis. I do think he's the best wide receiver out of the New England wide receivers to play this week. I'm not projecting a ton of fantasy points. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he's enough work to be a fine low to mid wide receiver 3. Jordan Addison is coming off a 30-point fantasy performance, and he's had 8 and 9 targets in each of the past 2 weeks. I don't think he has quite the fantasy day that he had this past week against the Arizona Cardinals, who are one of the better defenses in terms of opposing wide receiver production, but I think he's a fine wide receiver 3 for us this week, but I don't think he scores a touchdown. Deebo Samuel's in a bit of a cold streak right now. He's had 2 games in a row with less than 10 fantasy points. I don't think that continues with the return of Brock Purdy, but I don't think he has the best day in a really tough matchup against the Buffalo Bills. Now we have wide receivers that I think are in that mid wide receiver 2 to high-end wide receiver 3 range. We have Cooper, Thielen, Judy, Mooney, Pittman Jr., Smith, Dell, Shakir, Adams, and Jennings. So Amari Cooper's had a little bit of a tough going since he's arrived in Buffalo. He has scored a touchdown with them. I do think he happens to score a touchdown here against San Fran, but it is a tough matchup. Adam Thielen caught a couple of balls in his return to Carolina off of IR. Tampa Bay is a great matchup for him. I think he sees quite a bit of utilization in this game, but I'm not projecting a touchdown. In regards to Jerry Jeudy, since Jameis Winston's been their quarterback, he has been fantastic for fantasy. I think that even in a tough matchup against Denver where he could see some Pat Surtain, I still think he's a fine wide receiver 3. Darnell Moneyman Mooney has been a fantastic surprise for us in fantasy this season. Even though he's facing the Chargers, who are rather stingy against wide receiver production, I do think he scores a touchdown and has a decent fantasy day for us overall. Michael Pittman Jr. has had 9.6 or more fantasy points in each of the past 2 weeks. I do think with Josh Downs being out this week, he sees some extended work. He's also seen at least 7 targets in each of the past 2 games. I think he sees about 10 targets in this game and is a fine low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 type of play for us this week. Devontae Smith is playing against Baltimore. He is questionable to play. I do think he toughs it out, but he's had 2 really tough fantasy weeks the last 2 times he's played, and until we see more of that high-end production for him, I am going to have him a little bit lower in these rankings. Tank Dell has been a little bit disappointing for us in fantasy coming off the broken leg. I do think he's going to start ramping things up towards the end of the year, and the Jacksonville Jaguars are a matchup that he should be able to exploit. I do think he scores a touchdown, but overall has a somewhat limited yardage day for us. Khalil Shakir has had double-digit fantasy points in each week since week 6. I think that continues here even in a tough matchup against San Fran. I think he's going to be their chain mover, but I'm not projecting a touchdown. Devontae Adams has had at least 6 targets in each week since week 7. I think that continues here against the Seattle Seahawks, who are rather stingy against wide receiver production. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he has a decent day overall, leading to him being mid wide receiver 2 to potentially low-end wide receiver 2. Juwan Jennings has seen at least 7 targets in each of the past 3 weeks and seen 11 targets in 2 of the past 3 as well. I think that with the return of Brock Purdy, he's going to be good for us again in fantasy. I'm not projecting a touchdown, but I think he has a solid wide receiver 2 day for us overall. If you like what you've seen and heard so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Make sure you check out my running back, tight end, and quarterback rankings videos as well, and make sure you give my profile on X a follow. I'm going to leave that in the description. Thanks. Now we have wide receivers that I think are in that mid wide receiver 2 to low end wide receiver 1 range. We have Metcalf, Flowers, BTJ, Higgins, Wilson, JSN, Ridley, McConkey, Pickens, and London. DK Metcalf has had a bit of a tough going the past 2 weeks. I do think he sees quite a bit of Sauce Gardner, which is a really tough matchup, but I think he sees a couple grabs in this game and is a fine wide receiver 2. Zay Flowers has been a little bit streaky this season, but he's had double-digit fantasy points in each of the past 2 weeks. I do think against Philadelphia, even though they are one of the tougher defenses, that he is going to see enough volume to overcome it and be a fine wide receiver 2. Brian Thomas Jr. is playing against Houston. Prior to T-Law exiting, he was a top 12 wide receiver for us in fantasy. I think that against Houston, he can absolutely exploit the matchup versus them. He did earlier this season. And I think with T-Law returning to action, he's going to be a startable fantasy asset for us every single week. T. Higgins, while he does miss a lot of time with injury, when he does play, he's a great asset for us in fantasy. Even though he is matched up against Pittsburgh, I do think he sees enough production to be a good asset for us this week, but I'm not projecting a touchdown. Garrett Wilson has been on a bit of a cold streak, but I do think he scores a touchdown here in what is a decently tough matchup against the Seattle Seahawks. JSN, throughout the first year and a half of his career, was inexplicably not given any target volume for the most part. Then the past 3 weeks, they said, hey, maybe this guy's good. We should probably try getting the ball or something. And who could have guessed that would produce results? It is a tough matchup against the Jets, but I think he sees enough short area work to give us a solid fantasy day. Calvin Ridley has been a little bit streaky recently. He's given us some 20-point days, but he's also given us sub 10-point days. The Washington Commanders are definitely a matchup that he can exploit. I do think he scores a touchdown and has a solid fantasy day for us overall. Ladd McConkey has had at least 14 fantasy points in each of the past 2 weeks. The Atlanta Falcons, I don't think are going to really be able to do much to prevent him scoring us fantasy points. I do think he scores a touchdown, and I think he's a really good play for us this week in fantasy. George Pickens is coming off a sub 10-point fantasy day for us, but before that, with Russ Wilson, has been a godsend. I do think against the Cincinnati Bengals, he sees quite a bit of target volume and does score a touchdown. Drake London is playing against the Chargers. He's been a little bit hot and cold this season. Recently, he's been a little bit cold. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he sees quite a bit of production as they look to keep in this game versus the Chargers. Now we have wide receivers that I think are solidified wide receiver ones, but probably less likely to be the wide receiver one this week. We have MHJ, Cortland Sutton, and Cooper Kupp. Marvin Harrison Jr. has been very hot and cold this season. I do think, though, against Minnesota, he is capable of smashing the cornerback matchups. I do think Kyler Murray is going to find him for a touchdown, and I think he's going to have a top 10 day for us in fantasy. Cortland Sutton has been a top 6 wide receiver in 3 of the past 4 weeks. I don't think Cleveland's going to be able to do anything about him. I do think he scores a touchdown and is a solid top 12 play for us in fantasy. Cooper Kupp has hit at least 15 fantasy points in each game since week 6. I don't see any reason for that to discontinue against the Saints. I don't think there's anybody on that team that can cover him, and I do think he scores a touchdown. Now I have wide receivers that I think are mid to elite wide receiver ones with a realistic shot at being the wide receiver one this week. We have Evans, Jefferson, McLaurin, Chase, Nakua, Collins, and Brown. Mike Evans is looking for his 11th straight 1,000-yard season. I think Baker Mayfield is going to heavily target him throughout the entirety of the rest of the season in an effort to do so. And so I do think that he's going to be a fringe top 10 play for the rest of the season due to sheer target volume alone. Justin Jefferson is in a bit of a slump recently, having scored less than 10 fantasy points in 2 of the past 3 weeks. I do think the Arizona Cardinals, while they are in general a tougher matchup for wide receiver production, I don't think they're going to be able to do anything. I think they're going to look to grease the wheel and get him some extra production this game, and I do think he scores a touchdown. Terry McLaurin has been amazing for us in fantasy. Who could have guessed if you give him a decent quarterback that he was going to smash for us in fantasy? While Tennessee's pass defense is very stingy, they did lose L'Jarius Sneed to IR. I do think he's going to have a solid day and score another touchdown for us in fantasy. Jamar Chase has had at least 11 targets in each week since week 8. I don't see any reason for that to discontinue, even against Pittsburgh. While their defense is rather stingy, Jamar Chase is on a tear recently, and when he gets going, you continue to start him. Obviously, you're not benching him, but I do think he scores a touchdown once again and has over 100 receiving yards. Puka Nacua has had 18 or more fantasy points in 4 of the past 5 weeks. I see no reason for that to discontinue against the Saints. I think he and Cooper Kupp eat, and I think both of them score a touchdown. Nico Collins, the last time he played Jacksonville, had 33 fantasy points. I don't think he has quite that good of a game, but I do project over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown. A.J. Brown is coming off a wide receiver 6 finish in which he had over 20 fantasy points. He draws Baltimore, who is the worst defense at preventing wide receiver production. I'm projecting over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown for him as well. And so to review, among the remaining wide receivers left to play, wide receivers that I think are in that mid to low end wide receiver 3 range, we have Nick Westbrook-Akine, Mitchell, Vele, Douglas, Addison, and Samuel. Wide receivers that I think are in that mid wide receiver 2 to potentially high end wide receiver 3 range. We have Cooper, Thielen, Judy, Mooney, Pittman Jr., Smith, Dell, Shakir, Adams, and Jennings. Wide receivers that I think are in that mid wide receiver 2 to potentially low end wide receiver 1 range. We have Metcalf, Flowers, BTJ, Higgins, Wilson, JSN, Ridley, McConkey, Pickens, and London. Wide receivers that I think are firmly entrenched in wide receiver 1 territory, but not likely candidates to be the wide receiver 1 this week. We have MHJ, Sutton, and Cup. And then wide receivers that I think are mid to elite wide receiver 1s that I think have a realistic shot at being the wide receiver 1 this week. We have Evans, Jefferson, McLaurin, Chase, Nakua, Collins, and AJ Brown. All right, you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Is there somebody that I'm not projecting for enough fantasy points? If so, let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. With that being said, make sure you check out my running back, tight end, and quarterback rankings as well, and give me a follow on X. I'm going to leave that in the description. Thanks.